Thank you. That's really good to have a good get the technology sorted out at the start. And thank you also for coming here in the cold and for welcoming me so much to Helsinki. It's my second time here. I really like Helsinki for reasons that will become apparent, I think, over the course of the talk a little bit as well. And as we've mentioned, I'm at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm talking today from my PhD thesis across a couple of different publications about neurodiversity, about affect, but then also thinking about queer labour and the kinds of work we do in special education classrooms and early childhood classrooms when thinking about neurodiversity and inclusion. So I just thought I would start with a couple of prompts about who I am, first of all. So as Rika mentioned, I'm a lecturer at the moment in education at Manchester Met. My research is interdisciplinary, so I use critical disability studies, early childhood education, cultural studies, and art. My interests lie across these different spaces. I'm also a musician, and a composer and a producer, and that's part of the work that I do too. And both before and during my PhD and after for a little while, I was a special education teacher. And so my work is theoretical, but I also have quite grounded in practice too. And that's kind of what animates a lot of the thinking that I do is this attention to what happens in schools and in classrooms. I've had a career-long interest in autism specifically, and when I was working in special education, I became very much aware of shared experiences and shared political priorities that exist between queerness and neurodiversity. Not that they're the same, but there are similarities in the political intentions that the two groups have, and that it felt important to me to explore, and that's fundamentally what animated the thesis. I just thought it might be helpful to start with a few key terms, not really related to the PhD, but words that I wanted to say quite a lot. So I thought we could just maybe start with these. First of all, the idea of neurodiversity. This word slips a lot in common parlance, and so I thought it might be helpful just to remind ourselves that we're speaking about a diversity of neurological styles. So humans are diverse. We're not speaking about an individual person with an individual diagnostic label. Neurodivergence, on the other hand, implies a divergence from some kind of majority, and this is where we find individual diagnostic labels. So people who are disabled, who are autistic, who are dyslexic, or not typical in some way, might use the word neurodivergent to refer to themselves. And the term did come about from a kind of counter politics. It wasn't initially a medicalized term, it was a politics of refusal of normality that the word came about through. And then finally, neurotypicality. So this is the word that we used for normatively abled people, majoritarian people, and so somebody who doesn't have a recognized neurodivergence. Again, I'm not going to theorize these words really, but I'm going to use them quite a bit, so I thought it was just helpful to start with them. And to say that the thesis set out to complicate these ideas and to try to think across and between them in ways that were messier and more grounded in what happens in classrooms and less in the kind of essentialism of these terms. So I'll start just with a very brief introduction to my PhD study, then I'll move on to think through some of the concepts and background that were important to me in kind of setting up the project. After this, I'll talk through what research creation is as a way of doing research, the methods that I used, and the methodological intentions that I worked with. I'm then going to talk about some findings from across a few different papers, but that were kind of integral to the thesis. And the main contribution of the thesis was this concept, autisms. So I'll illustrate how that concept kind of worked in the practice. If there's time at the end, I'll speak about some ongoing work that me and some colleagues are doing. If not, then I'll fast forward that part because it probably is very interesting. Anyway, so my PhD research study explored how ability or neurotypicality is something that's always in process and always in motion, and that it emerges at the intersection of raciality and disability. And so in my work, I use process philosophies and artistic methods to problematize what normal means. I'll explain both of those ideas later in the talk. It took place as a 14-month in-school artist researcher residency with a neurodiverse class of early childhood class. So some children had been diagnosed with labels of special educational need, and some children didn't have those labels. There were 30 children in the class. They were aged 5 to 6 at the start of the study and aged 6 to 7 at the end of the study. So it ran across two or part of 2 academic years. What I say now, I say because it's important to the work, not because I think that there's any kind of deficit that I'm trying to tap into. But the cohort was very diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language. So we had 42 different languages in the school, and the research cohort has 17 different languages. Most children were new to English. Languages in the research cohort included Akan, Arabic, 2 different Chinese languages, Bengali, Czech, English, Finnish, Romanian, Polish, Spanish, Turkish, and Urdu. And yet the wider community is home to 43 different home languages. There's also significant mobility in the school cohort. So about 25% of the school leave every year, and another 25% come in from elsewhere. So there's a constant rotation of who attends the school. And it's in the 3% most economically deprived boroughs in the whole country. But that's really important because it means something about what disability is and does when you're in this really complicated context with lots of different patterns of overlapping oppressions. Disability means something different there. I'm going to argue over the next hour. Oh, just less than. And again, my work was done as music composition. So I composed music with the young people, with the children, and with the other members of staff to see what happened and what kinds of changes we could make together through that happening. And all the way through the talk, I'm going to be very cautious about the claims that I make. So I talk about changes that happened for a few seconds at a time, and then we're gone, very momentary things. We didn't save the world in any way. The methods that I used were field notes, audio recordings, and electrodermal activity sensors. If there's time, I'm going to talk about these through the framework of the gizmo. We'll see if there is space for that though. I'll explain why I use those as the talk goes on as well. So conceptual framework. There are quite a few different theories that I put to work to get to the point of doing the kind of work that I wanted to do. And so I thought I'd just start by going through the actual title of the thesis as a kind of hint of those possibilities. So the Neuroqueer is a scholar activist framework. It was something that developed in online internet communities. People like Remy Yogo, Nick Walker, they created this concept as a way of thinking differently about neurodiversity. It made its way into a kind of scholarly space in 2017, and Remy Yogo published Authoring Autism, and that kind of brought the neuroqueer concept to the academy in a way that it hadn't been previously. And so when I think about this title, Neuroqueering Noise, I think about it as kind of 4 pieces. There's the neuro, there's the queer, there's the ing, and then there's the noise. So there's sort of 4 elements. So the neuro, I think, is about autism, disability labels, and language of diversity and divergence. And that's really integral to what the neuro does. The queer is about queer and crypt theories, ideas of identity, but also of art and of cultural practices. And that's really important to what the queer does in the thesis. For me, the ing is about process philosophies and processes, and also propositions. Propositions are a really important part of what how I did the research, and so I'll spend some time talking about those too. And then noise. For this to me is about sound, it's about affect, and it's about music. And so for the next sort of 10 minutes, I'll just talk through each of these pieces in turn. I find it very difficult to talk about theory in a way that's remotely interesting. So if you want me to speed up, just yell and I'll speed up. I think it's helpful in some ways to sort of start with the most mainstream models of how we understand disability in England. So the medical individual model is probably the one that we're all kind of born into. We understand disability as being something that rests inside an individual body. It's the problem of the individual body, and the only way to solve the problem of disability is to repair or remove that individual body. So it's very much an individual process. The social models, which are different from different countries, but in general, think about disability and impairment as being two different things. So impairment is inside an individual, but disability happens when that individual can't access society. So think about, for instance, a wheelchair user, and they might have the impairment of not being able to walk, but that's only a disability when society doesn't include ramps or doesn't include other kinds of access. So those are the social models. It maintains, though, a very normative notion of impairment. So impairment is real, that body is impaired, it's not functioning the way it's supposed to, and so we should accommodate it. The critical perspectives that I draw from take a slightly different approach. They say that impairment is also a social construct. So there's no such thing as impairment, there are just different kinds of embodiments that need different things, and we should approach each individual on their own terms. So the idea is that we challenge normative expectations of what a body is supposed to be able to do. So in my work, I followed Julie Milich and Sami Shah, who are both cultural studies disability scholars, in saying that critical disability studies is my methodology. So I used the research methods on this study to unsettle what ability and typicality mean. That's why I did the research and what I used them to do. So again, thinking from the most mainstream point of view, first of all, so we commonly think about autism as a triad of social differences, social communication, interaction, and imagination, and these sometimes co-occur with sensory processing differences. But there is a tension in critical autism studies that my research tried to speak back to, and that is, what is the word autism? And the field is really uncertain about what this word means in lots of ways. For some people, it's a very real pattern of capacity and disability, and it's very much a real thing. For others, it's made up. It's an invention. It's something that's created at specific points of people to pathologize that a whole section of society. At the same time, it's also thought about as a pattern of identity and experience, a disruption of identity. It's often thought about as being caught up in racial logics, and there are questions as to who can write about it, why they should write about it, and how, and so on. But this tension between different versions of autism has resulted in whole special issues being published, just arguing about what the word actually means and what it should be used for. And so what my study tried to do was to say, yes, it's all of these things all at the same time, and there's something to be gained by trying to think across the multiplicity. Yeah, to try to think about autism as a constant multiplying in the classroom. Oh, well, yeah, I've written, that's me. I've written about that specifically. So moving on now to the idea of queerness. So I take queerness in the way that disability studies scholar Eli Clare and queer studies scholar Mel Chen think about it. So there's two different things that queer can be. It's first a noun and an adjective, which thinks about things as being bounded, temporally fixed, static, permanent, is to describe somebody. So this is a queer, that's a queer person, right? So it's about a label or an essentialist something. And the dictionary defines a queer in that noun form as meaning strange, odd, unfamiliar, or dubious. I like dubious as a word, that's good. So then the other form of queerness that we might think with is as a verb or a process. So let's queer something. So then rather than describing something as being strange or odd or unfamiliar, instead the verb form of queerness is about making something strange, odd, or unfamiliar. We'll take something that we think we know about, like autism, and we'll make it new for ourselves, we'll make it unfamiliar to ourselves. And again, there's a tension between these two forms, right? There's a tension between the noun form of queerness and the verb to queer, to unsettle, to disrupt, which to me very much resembles the same tension in critical autism studies. Is this an essentialist pattern of experience, of identity, a pathological label, or is it some kind of processual complexity that needs thinking through and might actually do something to normal? So that's how I apply queerness and queer theory to the idea of neurodivergence. Jose Esteban Munoz is a very important queer theorist to my work. He describes, based on Michel Peixot's work, three different strategies for how marginalized people might relate to dominant cultural and ideological forms. So the idea of identity, first of all, where the marginalized person has to subsume or pass or hide themselves. Counter-identity, which is where you get sort of countercultural movements that actively resist normal. And then disidentity, which chooses instead to work on and against and challenge what normal means. And also for Munoz, he writes that queerness is not yet here. So it's some kind of ideality, it's in the future. We have to work constantly to try and activate its potential. And these ideas were very important to me again when thinking about autism and neurodiversity. I wanted to keep it open. I wanted to keep it something that we didn't quite know what it meant instead of having a very fixed and bounded definition. And I was also conscious of the need to think between the importance of autistic identity, not being autistic myself, not being neurodiverse, not being neurodivergent, the importance of respecting autistic count identity while trying to work on and against what neurotypicality means. So this kind of like a three model way of relating to the majority was an important concept for me too. So these ideas have already been put to work with regards to race and disability in lots of ways. Sarah Ahmed and Sean Gay have written about the ways in which race is shaped by emotion and emotional responses. Alison Kaper has done similar work around disability. And Jasbir Puar argues that disability and ability aren't actually a binary. And instead, what we have is this constant oscillation between capacity and ability. That's very much in a specific geo-histo infrastructural context. Yeah, somebody that has somebody that is a wheelchair user in one country at one time, in one social class, of one ethnic background, will have a completely different experience of that same disability in a different context. And so these words are, yeah, it's very much more contextual and very much more in the moment. And again, that idea is really important for how I think about neurodiversity in the project. But it's a moment by moment thing that we want to unsettle and change as we go. Which leads me into process philosophy, the ing of neuroqueering noise. What process philosophy? Yeah, so if ability and disability, if you want to think about these things as being messy and contingent and processes, then we need intellectual resources to do this. And so I'm inspired by the work of Karen Barad, Mel Chen, Deleuze and Guattari, and Alfred North Whitehead. So process philosophy thinks about the ways in which things that are static or singular are actually parts of networks and processes. So nothing's ever real and singular and bounded. It's always part of some kind of process. So one of the resources that I use for this is affect theory, which thinks about how emotion and sensation and feeling are physical forces that move about and between bodies. These leave impressions on entities as they move around, which then change how we relate to future affects and future encounters. Generally, in affect theory, those are more than human attention. So it's about humans, but also about non-human animals, non-animal life, and non-living matter. In my research, I don't tend to think about non-humans. I'm very much concerned with humans and humans in classrooms specifically. But there is in more broadly in theory, an attention to these things. As I mentioned in the abstract, I'm also inspired by Karen Barad's work. Um, Karen Barad writes about diffraction and the ways in which choosing one theoretical framework for your research will materialize the bodies that are in that encounter differently to using a different theoretical framework. And for me, this comes with an ethical responsibility. That if we're going to materialize something, we have to be responsible for what it is that we're materializing, but also responsible for who and what we're dematerializing. And so I mentioned earlier that there are all these different orientations towards autism, these different perspectives of autism. So Karen Barad's work here gives me resources for thinking about that. If we're going to go into a classroom and assume autism is one thing, then we're going to dematerialize the other things that are also autism in that moment. So trying to keep a hold of multiple different versions of autism at the same time is kind of what the work does as an ethical intention. In my research, I use propositions to shape the creative activity. So in research creation, we have to have things that create that creation. And propositions for me are how I go about doing that. So propositions in analytical philosophy are true or false statements. And they're things that we can easily prove or disprove. So for instance, the statement, it is raining. We know it's not raining, or we know that it is raining. It's true or it's false, and it's very clear. Likewise, elephants can fly. Well, they can't, but we know that it's false, and so it's very easily judgeable as being that. So truth and falseness was really important. But for Whitehead, he was less interested in the idea of true and false, and more that what is lured by the proposition is interesting. So he wouldn't care, for instance, if it's not raining outside. It doesn't matter to him. He's interested that the potential of rain has been something that we thought about. And Whitehead would argue that by bringing the potential of rain into the conversation, then we change how things move forward in the world. To summarize, yeah, they conjure an interruption of some kind to the typical flow of relevance. And so I argue that in my research that it's important to keep hold of this notion of true and false, but so often the proposition is used in ways that forget about truth and falsehood. But we live, I also see the news from Iowa this morning, we live in moments in which lies about the past, in which myths about our histories are mobilized in ways that reinforce power. And so we have to keep hold of this notion of things that are true and false, and instead think about what goes along with truth. The truth's always contextual, rather than making statements otherwise. And so, as I said, I use propositions in my research as a way of curating the creative activity. And finally, noise. So I'm a composer, I'm a musician, I've also worked in early years. So noise is a big part of the day, right? When you work in an early childhood classroom. Sound has been thought as affect in that it incapacitates and debilitates. And sound has also been thought as being caught up in power structures. So sound creates race and racism. It isn't just race and racism initially might appear to be a visual phenomenon, but they're not. The sound is very much implicated in race and racism too. So Jennifer Lynn Stover has this idea of the sonic color line that was very informative for my research. Stover argues that sound is filtered by white listening ears between music and noise. I've heard somebody say that classical music is real music, but hip hop is noise. But that's what's happening there, right? It's the racializing technology of the ear. So music and noise, word and sound, sense and nonsense, proper and improper, controlled and excessive, quiet and loud. These are binaries that the listening ear, the white listening ear, goes through when it filters sounds as being appropriate, i.e. white, or inappropriate, i.e. non-white. While this is a really interesting idea in thinking about race, it hadn't been done in disability before, much to my surprise. I've searched forever, but no one had really written about how the sounds of different kinds of bodies becomes filtered as a disabling technology. Yeah, but how we think about disability isn't just about looking through the eyes, but we hear something that we then use to sort bodies. So that hadn't been done, and that was something that I really felt my work could contribute to. Just to recap then on the conceptual framework that I use, there is a tension in critical autism studies as to what autism is, and my work responds to that tension. It does so by using queer theory, that we might rethink labels such as autism and disability as processes that are always caught up in systems of power. Attention to these processes requires process philosophies and things that let us think about process in different kinds of ways so that we can unsettle those power institutions for a few seconds at a time. And in my work, I do this by trying to intervene how sound becomes sorted. Yeah, so I'm trying to intervene using propositions in how we think about the different sounds that we hear, that we might prevent them from being sorted easily as music or noise, or as word and sound, or as sense and nonsense for just a few moments, always. So that's kind of the conceptual framework that I use. I just wondered, because there were so many ideas there, if there's something that anybody wants me to go back over before I move on, or if not, we can save those questions for the end. Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, there's so many of them. I tried to cut them down, but I can't seem to help myself. Um,
Just reminding me of speaking slow.
yes, okay, yeah. That's the other thing that I can't help myself with my slow speech. So research creation is a way of researching social material processes as and through artistic practice. So we make art, we write a song, we decoupage something as a way of understanding a social phenomenon. It's a feminist practice, it's a queer practice, and it's an anti-colonial practice too. So there's always a political intention with research creation, and it's always the challenging systems of power. It's also transdisciplinary. And this is why I was drawn to research creation specifically, because I was already thinking through a few different disciplines. I was a teacher doing research in early childhood classroom. I was a composer, thinking about sound, and now I was a researcher. So research creation gave me the justification, really, in some ways, to use the practices that I was already using anyway. Yeah, the things that I was already thinking through and with research creation allowed me to do that, I suppose. As I said already, it's animated by propositions. So statements, objects, things that we introduce that let us speculate or think differently for a few moments. And so in my research, as I said before, we did the research as a series of musical experiments and composition activities over the course of 14 months. So just over a whole academic year. This took the form of sort of 6 miniature projects. I'm not going to talk about all of them here. We can come back to them later if you're interested. But the ones in red, I will share little pieces of data from. So the pilot study, where I explained electrodermal activity, I mentioned that earlier, the biosensors. Um, that was the first project, and we used the Villa Lobos piece, the little train of the Cape Era, as kind of a grounding for us. The other project that I'll speak from is walking through Leeds on a windy day, which is a sound walking project. It happened around the local community, near to the school, and we tried to unsettle what space sounds like. I'm also going to speak about deep listening and synesthesia, which was a series of experiments that tried to make us experience sound through different sensory modes. So not just hearing sound, but feeling it through touch, seeing it, these kinds of things. So those are the 3 projects that I'm going to share little bits of data from today. The methods consisted of audio recordings that were run all the way through every single workshop. Field notes, so I use these to write down things that I thought the microphones might have missed, or also my own reflections on what had happened. And then the electrodermal activity gizmos. So these were central to the funding that I got to do my PhD. The idea would be that we would use and challenge the kind of uptake of these devices. What they do is measure stress. So you wear them on the wrist, and through measuring the amount of perspiration that you have, and they are supposed to be able to tell how stressed you are. They're very frequently used in research on autistic people. There's been some claims, for instance, that it can interrupt a meltdown, that it can detect some kind of stress response before it happens. And they're caught up in the medical model and in issue of legibility and of essentialism. They also materialize one kind of autism in the classroom. So I mentioned earlier that there's all these different theories of autism, all these different faces or orientations. And these devices, thinking about autism as a real life, biological, individual something, they materialize that very, very clearly in that kind of research. So I use them to try to map against that use of the research. I tried to use them in ways that thought about autism more broadly, and that also messed with how the devices work. One thing I have to say is that they are very precarious. When you wear them, you have to sit very still. You can't change temperature. You can't breathe too loud. You can't sneeze. Can't talk. Definitely can't jump or run or flap or any of the things that if you've worked in an early childhood classroom, it's a pretty bizarre list of things that you can't do with them. Um, So they were very easy to mess with, is what I'm saying in the research. So as I mentioned earlier, the finding of the thesis, which I'm going to start with so we can see how it unfolded, was that autism is always multiple, that we materialize autism constantly in different ways in the classroom, whether as researchers or as teachers. And so we have to keep these multiple different orientations in mind as we do our work in a kind of frictional tension. So they don't go together, and it takes work to kind of keep them together and to have them kind of rub up against each other in ways that are problematic. So yes, autism is always a problematic explanatory framework. It doesn't really exist. It's a made up something. And of course, it is also completely real and no less real for having been made up. Yeah, so it's an invention and it's real at the same time, of course. It's also identity and a community and a site of cultural production, and it has to be that at the same time. It's also a problematizing of what neurotypicality means. You can see that in the classroom too. The lines between the neurotypical and the neurodivergent are too messy and porous to really hold. And it's also a plurality, a racializing process, and a million other things that are and are yet to come. So it has to be all of these things, even though they're incommensurate. So Jose Munoz, he writes of the importance of the inhuman, of future versions of the human being, that it's a queer labor of the incommensurate. So putting things together that can't possibly go together because they have to. It's completely necessary because they are those things. And so what the research tried to do was illustrate some of, it's a bit too low down, sorry, it said, next few lines will illustrate some of the labors, some of the activities that we did to try and materialize this kind of multiplicity of autism all of the time. So the first project that I'm going to show a little bit from are walking through leaves on a windy day and deep listening. So these two projects happened concurrently. We wanted to do a phonographic walk around the school where we walk around and record the sounds of the local space. This was because of the curriculum in the school at that time. It was about the human and physical features, and I was an extra body. I made the walk easier. So I went along, I was an extra body, and we did the walk and we recorded the sounds that we heard. What I should have said earlier on was that there are two classes in the year group, and so I taught the research sessions to both classes. The research was only done with one class, the other class just did activities that resembled the same thing. And so there was parity across the year group between these activities. So our attention during the walk was to the sounds that we heard, and we prepared the students to do that kind of listening through several weeks of deep listening activities. And some children during the walk chose to wear ear defenders so they couldn't hear anything, and then chose to listen that way. And other children put sleeping masks on and off. I'll explain the ridiculous reason why that happened a bit later on. Two children also wore EDA devices. However, during the walk, it was a very windy day. So we got back to the classroom, played back the sounds, and we couldn't hear anything because the microphones had been tussled too much by the wind. So all that walking, all that recording, we had nothing to show for it. So instead, in the moment, I decided that we would list the different sounds that we'd heard, and we would recreate the soundscape at a later date once I, found sound effects. But the list of the sounds that the children offered me were increasingly speculative as the activity went on. So, for instance, the children had heard on our walk through inner city leads, buses, footfalls, conversations, seagulls, and me talking nonstop. So that's all realistic. Other things they heard were a burp in my neck and a heartbeat. So that came from the ear defenders, right? So the microphone couldn't have picked that up. So we had to do something to make that be possible to hear. Other sounds were even more speculative, but realistic. So I hadn't heard a dog bark, I hadn't heard a TV, an ambulance, or a thunderstorm, but they at least make sense. I could imagine that they might have occurred, or there might be some definition of those there. But then another child said that they heard a gorilla. I definitely hadn't heard that, and there was no gorilla nearby. Again, because this line between the speculative and the real was something we were playing with, I chose to include all those different sounds. in the soundscaping activity. But because we'd already kind of ended up in this kind of speculative space, and we began to talk about other kinds of activities and other kinds of composition that we could do on top of the soundboard. So this ended up in a 35-minute audio composition that I will share a couple of minutes of later on. So two children, like I said, wore the EDA devices. So before the walk, I spent a long time talking about critical use and what we could do with these devices. So first of all, I wore one, and I broadcast my own EDA signal onto the whiteboard in the classroom. EDA produces lines of data. It looks a little bit like an EKG or a heart exam. So while I was on the board, I began jumping around and moving my arms and stuff, and the children could see in real time how the signal was being disturbed by the way in which I was moving. So jumping on the spot, for instance, got me very hot. I began to perspire, and so the signal went through the roof, and the children could watch this happening in real time. But then when they put them on themselves, they were aware that they could also disrupt the signal in different kinds of embodied ways. While I was doing this, one of the children mentioned that it looked like a train line. I was never quite sure what that meant, that it looked like a train line, but the idea of a train I thought was very interesting. So in the following week, I brought along my own version of the EDA device. So I call this a walking scoring device. It's a proposition in some ways. It allows one kind of creative activity while closing down others. So the idea is that you can draw sounds on the piece of paper, which is a toilet bowl. As you've drawn, you can pull it down and you can keep on going forever, but only in one direction. You can't go this way. Yeah. So it's a particular kind of enabling constraint. They look useful, right? So the toilet roll is tied to the cardboard with a piece of string. There's a bulldog clip at the end. There's some instruction written across the top. But in reality, they're ridiculous. If it's windy or rainy, the toilet paper falls apart. The board, it gets soggy and begins to fold. Pencils and pens poke through the tissue, and more often than not, the toilet paper rips. So rather than becoming bundled at the end, you end up with all these bits of paper everywhere. That kind of ridiculousness, to me, resembled the ridiculousness of the EDA device. And so I wanted to put those two ridiculous things side by side and make them both absurd. So Jack Halberstam writes that the desire to be taken seriously is precisely what compels people to follow the tried and true paths of knowledge production. And it was that kind of sort of desire to be taken seriously that I tried to refuse. By the way, at this time, I will talk about some of the mental health implications of trying to refuse ordinariness all the time in the PhD. It's very stressful. So I will hopefully have some time to talk through some of that at the end. I don't know the makeup of the people over here, but if you are PhD students and you are struggling, you are definitely not alone. So the following week, I introduced the children to Heitor Villa-Lobos' The Little Train with the Gabira. It's a performance by the Children's National Orchestra of England. So it's children playing this music. The music starts off very slowly, it gets very rapid and gains energy as it goes through, and then finally at the end calms down again. I invited the children to draw their own scores, making lines, marks on the paper as the music went on. By the end of the class, obviously, all the boards were broken. There was toilet roll everywhere. It was a train wreck. It was a disaster. So the next week, I gathered up all of the pieces of paper and gave them back to the children, and said, "Today we're going to make a new score out of the fragments." So they stuck them together in different kinds of ways. Some children made beautiful, clean, new lines by putting pieces together. Somebody else stacked them on top of each other, despite my best efforts to instruct them otherwise. So you ended up with these kinds of, like, you could see bits through each layer of toilet roll. Then we played the new scores. Then 1 week later, I printed off the scores from the EDA device. Just repeated this activity. We cut up the EDA scores, we put them together in new ways. You will hear this later on. I will share a piece where you can hear some of this work. This, for me, is about contesting the biological. We had this biological signal that came off the EDA device, which materializes a singular bounded version of the subject. And we intervened in that. We cut it apart, we made it new, and the biological signals were repurposed and mixed between the different bodies that we had in the room too. So it was no longer about a single person's EDA signal, that a single person, a bounded person. Instead, it became all mixed up with each other and created new kinds of frissons. They were inverted, they were upside down, they were back to front, they were on top of each other. It messed with what the EDA was creating. And so, of course, messed with the material version of autism the devices try to create. Yeah, the devices imagine autism as a single person, a bounded person. And so we were playing with that. We were playing with the notion of what the singular or bounded means. So as I said, the children recorded these really carefully scored compositions using handheld percussion. Excuse me. It was non-rhythmic, but two children began to improvise over the top of these percussion performances. One child has a diagnosis of autism. They have a one-to-one, and they have a SLT, a speech and language therapy support. That's Ray. The other child doesn't have a diagnosis, doesn't have support, but does demonstrate lots of behaviors that would not make you think of neurotypicality. They were 7, but they weren't speaking. They were doing lots of stimming practices. They had significant sensory processing differences. The difference is that Quadro is black. Quadro isn't his real name. In the UK, autism diagnoses are about 50% underrepresented amidst the Black community. And there's something about teachers not being able to see autistic type behaviors on the Black body. In sharing this example of the data and talking about this, what I'm not trying to do is imply that diagnosis is required, but that in this minute of audio, you can hear all kinds of practices that go against what neurotypicality came to mean in this moment. So these are non-rhythmic percussion compositions, and Quadro gave us a rhythmic vocal improvisation. So refused the planning, refused the bounds of what normal meant in that context, and gave us something very different that embodied joy, embodied refusal, and embodied this idea of, for me, disidentity. I'm going to play Quadro's clip first, actually. I've explained it better. So there's giggles, there's something that sounds like a bass drum. There's whistles, there's moments of joy. It's a very embodied. So very much opposed to what the activity was and to what neurotypicality had come to mean in that moment. Ray also improvised on top of her composition. The improvisation was stopped because the one-to-one who supports her pulled her away from the microphone when she began to do this vocal improvisation. There was something there to me about the idea of counter-identity. We know from clinical research that autistic people tend to have a better grasp of harmony than they do of rhythm. And that's very much evident in what Ray does in this moment. The melody that she sings is perfectly tuned to a B half diminished scale. So it resembles the pitches that we think with in terms of normative music. But yeah, it was stopped, which you'll hear when I share this short clip. So in that moment, the definition of noise included vocal improvisations. And the one-to-one adult removed Rose so that she couldn't continue the improvisation. So in the composition, you can hear a chord underneath everything. It's quite a dark sounding chord. It's I forgot what it is. It's B flat seven, half diminished, I think, from memory. Um, which I chose because it fits the scale that she's singing in. So what I tried to do by doing that was to ground that improvisation in the work. So suddenly it's not something that is a surprise or comes from nowhere, but you've been hearing it the whole time. By the time you get to raise improvisation now, it's something that you're already expecting. So again, a very slight tweak in what neurotypicality means for moments at a time. Oh, excuse me. And then so problematizing neurotypicality and identity. Um, Thinking through and challenging the idea that there is a normal against which to compare oneself. As I mentioned, we did a series of listening activities based on Paulina Oliveros' idea of deep listening. I'm going to read a little note from the field notes at this point, if that's okay. So we began with a discussion in which we listed some of the things that we ordinarily listen to. For instance, music. Brittany quickly suggested other music. I reminded her that we've already said music, but she interrupts exasperatedly to tell me no, other music that you listen to when you're doing writing, which to me implies Muzak-esque, chill Spotify playlists. Other examples of sounds that people listen to are TV, Batman, and Turkish music. Aaron said, Gangnam Style's my favorite song. Johan added, a balloon when they break. A clock, on the bus, the computer, teachers' voices, clocks, grown-ups. That's the same as voices, Mr. Shannon, says Abayan in a stage whisper. Microphones and drums. Then I explained deep listening as something that lets us listen really hard to really quiet sounds that are normally too quiet to hear. We listened to Leah from Oliveros' 1989 album, Deep Listening. I asked for words that could describe it. There's a short pause. No one's really sure how to describe it. Abayan suddenly offers dark as an adjective. So later, I had the children participate in an episode of Deep Listening themselves. My plan was that they should all lie on the carpet for about 10 minutes, and I would guide them and listen to things around the room. One of the children, for some reason, asked if they could put on ear defenders, which created like a stampede, right? Suddenly everybody wanted an ear defender, and I only had 10 pairs. So I had some sleep masks that I bought and left in the cupboard for an activity after. So suddenly they're all lying on the carpet. Half of them are wearing ear defenders. The rest of them are wearing sleep masks. I'm not really sure what's going to happen. But it goes surprisingly well. In the end, I stopped talking because I realized that I'm making more noise than them by trying to describe what's around them. And they mentioned hearing things like shouting pigeons, shouting children, excuse me, lots and lots of cars and noise, as well as Emma telling me off because she can hear me talking, the teacher paper waving, Ulash feeling the carpet, and the children outside hurting my ears. So we talked about how paying close attention with ears seems to make things seem louder. Suryanshu, who'd been wearing one of the ear defenders, said, one thing that I heard was that the sun was on my eyes and it was so bright. So Abhayan's dark and Suryanshu's hearing the sun so bright are examples of synesthesia. Synesthesia is a complication of the senses across different modes. So people might experience one sense, something that they see, but then hear a particular sound or a particular taste. Sibelius, my favorite composer, was a well-known synesthete, and he painted different parts of his home, Ionola, in colors that sounded like particular scales, and which in turn resembled the function of that part of the house. So, for instance, his stove was green, which to Sibelius sounded like the scale of F major. Synesthesia, like lots of neurodivergences, is more common in autistic people than in the general population. So Aaron Manning criticizes the idea of synesthesia because it relies on being able to separate sensory modes in the first place. But that in itself is a neurotypical concept. So she writes that synesthesia relies on an account of sensation that can be passed cleanly between sense modalities and between the bodies that are said to be the locations of that sense. Following week, I reminded the children of Abayan's dark and Suryanshu's hearing the sun so bright. We talked about how interesting it was that both children heard something that we couldn't see. So I set up a carousel of different activities that were designed to make us complicate and think across different sensory modes. On one table, a tiny Bluetooth speaker played back walking through leaves on a windy day with the bass EQ turned up really high. So there's a plank of wood initially that vibrated and they could feel it. Obviously, within 5 seconds, they all had it up in the air and all the different hands were melding together and pressing it. So the sound was going straight through them. So there is melding between the sense of touch and between the sense of sound. On a different table, 2 children had empathic devices, which were synced up to a pair of iPads, so they could see how the EDA signal was changing in the room. There was also a pair of claves, which are 2 sticks that you hit together, which recreated the phenomenon of biolooping. In autism research, biolooping is what happens when what's argued to happen when autistic children are given access to autistic therapy. They sometimes create the very symptoms that they're supposed to be getting rid of. This is all very medicalized language. I'm doing that on purpose because of the context. So we queered the idea of biolooping here. Rather than an individual body receiving the support that it needs and then being blamed for demonstrating those same needs, instead, the loop was across multiple bodies. The feedback of the EDA fed into the clave playing, which in turn fed back into the EDA. Another table had the ear defenders and sleep masks because they loved them. I got all kinds of stories about those that I could tell if it was time. And then a final table had I used the resources that were left in the cupboard from the topic on materials and I put a collection of musical instruments. I accompanied these with a small group of adjectives, things like metal, hard, but also fluffy, cold, blue, that didn't really match up with what was present. In this way, I was trying to recreate what Steph Barasu calls the sensory, contextual, and material aspects of sound. So in this context, the propositions that we used tweaked the reality of difference. All these senses were experienced across one another by all of the bodies. And when should I stop talking? Can you remind me? I've forgotten.
We have time total until 12, so it's.
If I go for another 5 minutes, is that okay? If I go 5 more minutes? So limitations. I think this is really important to talk about because people don't often talk about it. But specifically, I'm going to think about the EDA devices, but in the conversation afterwards, perhaps other examples. My critical use of the EDA rendered the data very difficult to analyze. I'm going to play you back a short excerpt of some of the EDA data now, so you can hear the kind of chaos that ensued because I'd used them in this way. So they're supposed to form sort of like quick peaks and then gentle troughs, quick peaks and then gentle troughs. Instead, I ended up with this. And this was because the way that the children were moving meant that the scale had to be compressed. So rather than very, very quick peak, gentle trough, instead everything was squashed flat. So you end up with these long sustained notes instead, but you can't really tell anything that's happening. And so I wrote about this. I'm going to read the excerpt about this. So trying to use electrodermal gizmos in a transdisciplinary project fundamentally did not work. This not working is necessary to critical use. To upsetting the ableist white supremacist assumptions of capacity built into positive methods. At the same time, the not working was unpredictable, fundamentally ruining any chance of my audibly salvaging much from them. Similarly, turning to affect theories does not work, in that such a turn cannot be successful within the narrow confines of what successful research is supposed to do. This is the point of it. Just as using the gizmos outside of positivist methods broke them, so too does bringing affect theory to bear in research break the ordinary measures of value through which we then need to stultify and write about it. So I was struggling between the same, yeah, using the gizmos in critical ways made them produce outcomes that I couldn't use anymore. And likewise, turning to affect was producing research outcomes that I couldn't write about, which is a very odd place to be in as a grad student. So I'm the biggest, yeah, I had to take a whole extra year extension just to kind of deal with these kinds of these issues. I thought it was important to attend to that here. So finally then, yeah, I just want to go back to the initiating concept, the thing that I started us off with, that autism is always multiple, that we're always materializing different autisms in the classrooms in different kinds of ways, but that we can pay more specific attention to what gets materialized. I tried to illustrate how through our music experiments, we materialize different parts of autism or different faces of autism for a few moments at a time in each of these interactions. At some moments, we point out the ways in which autism is very real, and at other times, we point out the ways in which it was a fabrication. At other times, we point out the importance of counter identity and autistic identity, things like spectral hearing, for instance, at the same time as problematizing the whole idea of identity and neurotypicality. So where have these things gone since? Excuse me. My research creation practice has carried on with Sarah E. Truman. We have a band now that we call Oblique Curiosities, and we write songs as a research practice. Some of the things that we've been thinking about are walking and songwriting. We've also thought about feminist new materialism and our songwriting project and how that gives us a way of addressing the impossible demands of new materialism. And we've also been interested in speculation and in queer futurity. I have a very short clip from the band just to show you the kind of thing that we do. So using concepts to write songs and think about what that process does. I've also developed an interest with Abigail Hackett at Sheffield Hallam University in early language and how the ideas that I explored in my thesis might help us rethink language in the youngest children. So we've just published an article when we think about the song and the value of opacity. And we're also interested in the entanglements of children's language with place. Meanwhile, with colleagues Wada Farah, Vishnu Nair, Rosie Fluid, Paula Badwan, Rachel Holmes, and Christina McRae, we're working on an edited collection written by and for practitioners that thinks about the body and early language in the classroom. And lastly, I just finished a part-time postdoctoral project about research mobility and using social material theories to think about how teachers engage with research. So this took the form of 4 different work streams: a media corpus linguistics analysis, and teacher life logging and focus groups, and digital tracing. I was very involved with that part of the project, looking at how teachers use digital resources and shapes their engagement with research, and then teacher development group. And that's it. I'm done. That's okay. Yeah, it wasn't too quick, wasn't too slow.